You've probably heard it 1,000 times. Learn from comics. Learn from manga. Everyone says it, but what does it really mean? Well, it's easy. You just have to read them. Hi, I'm Chris. Welcome to Panels in Progress, a channel about making comics and manga and learning through the process. Today's episode is all about learning from comics and manga. So grab your sketchbook, grab the comic you're working on, or just hang out because we're going to have a good discussion today. Alright, so we all read comics and manga. We love it. We enjoy it. It's something we obviously love to do because why? We want to make comics and manga. But when people talk about learning from comics and manga, it's a multi-level statement that sometimes gets lost. It could mean anything, really. I mean, it's obvious. You can learn how to make a comic or manga by reading it and looking at the art. And that's where a lot of people love to start and stop their study sessions when it comes to a comic or manga. But that's just the first step. The second step is looking at the story. How does that story unfold? Now, I do want to give you a fair warning that when you start studying from comics and manga, this new method will affect the way you view future comics and manga. But if you want to learn and get better at making a comic, then buckle in because I think these are practical methods. These are some methods that I use myself. So after you have read the comic, you've Googled and fell in love with the art style, that's when we want to go back and actually look at that story and how that story plays out. And this is something that you might not even notice while you're reading it the first time, but once you slow down and take a second look, you'll realize pacing is something that you can learn from comics. How much time something takes, how fast a scene moves, how long moments last, when silence is working for the scene, or how page turns land. If we go back to the fast scenes, obviously the easiest one is action comics. When something big is happening, a big fight scene, a big moment or action, the rate at which you are turning your pages to get to the next part because the action is so quick, that all counts as well. These are fast page turning comics. I'm thinking about your Duo Power Bombs, your Murder Falcons, Bleach, Naruto. Absolute Batman is a big hit right now. When those fight scenes are happening, they are fast and you can feel how fast they are just by the way the pages are laid out and by the action lines and how fewer panels are actually on the page. If we move into those slow moments like a horror comic or a thriller or something that's building anticipation, building that unknown, building that tension, you can think about Uzumaki, the way those panels, when something big is about to happen, you can see that time goes slower. Instead of going from scene to scene, he uses a method of moment to moment. Now, when you're reading a horror comic or a comic that builds tension or wants you to linger on a particular moment, that's when you're noticing that there's multiple panels of very little differentiation between them, like slowly walking through a dark passageway or slowly opening a door. Whenever you see that a panel has multiple steps of the same continuous movement, the artist is trying to draw out the level of anticipation and possibly leading you to a page turn. Junji Ito is obviously a master at this, and you can do it too. Something is Killing the Children, Werther Dell'Edera, also really well done, where he builds that tension and lets the moment linger on. when silence is working. Not every panel needs words. Not every panel needs an explanation. Sometimes you want a silent comic. Sometimes you want the characters' actions to be understood just as they are. Or it could be a tense argument between two characters that suddenly the argument's over and there's silence. They're still in the room, but they're not saying anything. And you let your camera or you let your paneling just linger on that moment to help the reader understand that this is a tense moment. The energy's still there, but we're not gonna rush on to the next scene. Try to notice these things while you're reading a comic or a manga. And of course, page turns. Page turns are super critical. If you want to keep your reader constantly wanting to know more or what happens next, make sure that you're putting those page turns exactly where you need them to be. This kind of goes back to page planning, but when you were reading a comic and you are working your way through the page, notice what the panel is on the end of the page. What creates that perfect page turn, and what happens on the next page? Is it satisfying or is it not? Sometimes we're turning because there's a question being asked at the end of the page, and then we're turning because we want to know the answer on the next page. Or for horror, there is a shocked face and we're turning the page to see the reveal of whatever the person is looking at. Notice these things. When you read a comic, before you turn the page, don't just turn the page, but notice, what did they set up on this page that leads you to want to turn the page? Because more often than not, if there's nothing engaging within that page, sometimes a reader will read the page, and yes, they could easily turn the page, but now because they've got something else to do, they have stopped reading. So notice what is keeping you moving through a story where you constantly want to turn the page, and what stops you. What stops you from going on? Have you noticed that when you've read a comic or a manga and you just were like, I can't anymore, I'm just going to stop this? What was happening during that page or during that scene that made you want to stop reading? Those are good things too. Sometimes, yes, we can learn what to do from a comic or manga, but we can also learn what not to do from a comic or manga. As you continue to work through comics and manga, and this actually occurs the more you read comics and manga, but you'll start to notice the panel language and how an artist, especially a professional, but they don't necessarily have to be a professional, but how they construct a page. How many face shots are they using? How many establishing shots are they using? How well are they moving the camera around so that you understand exactly where the characters are within the scene? And how many full body shots are they using? Do you even know what shot is which? One book that I can obviously recommend in this area specifically is Making Comics by Scott McCloud, as well as Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. I want to do a series of videos dedicated to both of these books, because even as old as these books are, there is a lot of solid information that I think is ground zero for making comics and making manga. Manga has some different techniques, and I haven't found the manga book that is the end-all be-all for manga, but when I do find that book, I would gladly add that to my list as well. But for now, when you are reading a comic, notice the page layout and how many times they are using certain panels and when they are using certain panels. The reason I love manga is because there's a lot of emotion put into different types of manga. There's always face shots and expressions of how the character is feeling in relation to what's going on with them or what's going on around them. Now, sometimes depending on the type of manga, that expression can be over exaggerated, the anger, the frustration, etc. But there's also those older manga where the emotion is more subtle, but you still understand it and feel it. And I think it's great to see the differentiation between both of those. You need exaggerated emotions, but you also need those subtle emotions too, depending on your style. But notice both of them. Notice what works in what situations. Manga does this great thing where sometimes it could be a completely serious moment, but then within the next page they'll do a completely exaggerated expression or reaction, and that's all to convey certain things. So just take a notice at that. Comics, depending on the type of comics and depending on the style, you may or may not have that exaggeration, but it could be there. It really just depends. Another thing to notice when it comes to paneling is how are they using their backgrounds? How are they designing the world that the characters are in? Is it a sea of nothingness, blank backgrounds as far as the eye can see? I mean, that is an amateur mistake that most of us make because we don't like backgrounds. But when you are reading a comic or manga, notice how much is going into that background. An establishing setting, a connecting background or environment that feels alive and lived in. Is the room, what I like to do, especially when I am reading manga or comics, is I like to look at the environment, but see what else is in there. See how far they go into it. If they have a kid in a room, a bedroom, it's not just a bed, a closet, and a window. Usually there's toys, there's posters, there's things that tell you about the character that you wouldn't know because they're in the background. Or a person's work office. What's in the office? Is it just a desk and a window or a cubicle? No. There's things on the desk. There's coffee stain mugs or post-it notes and things that inform you about the environment. Now, if it is a cubicle and all you see is a sea of cubicles, then that also tells you about the environment, that it's very contained and closed and endless. So notice these things while you are reading comics and manga. Backgrounds are equally important, and what the artist chooses to show you of that background is important. Maybe not in the forefront of things, but to build a living world, it is. And while you're noticing the backgrounds within those panels, also notice when they choose not to use a background. And then ask yourself, why is there no background here? Why isn't it necessary? Usually it's because the moment is focused on the character's expression or reaction, and anything else involving that is not needed. And again, the more comics and manga you read, the more you'll notice what works and what doesn't work. So let's talk about some things that don't work. Busy panels, overcrowded pages, weak transitions, and unclear acting. Now, busy panels, confusing pages, sometimes this goes hand in hand. Usually, if the artist is putting way too much into the paneling, way too many panels on a page, with way too many small actions or way too many big actions, usually it's just way too much. I've experienced this multiple ways. One, it could be that the values of the manga are off. Maybe it was a painting that they tried to switch to grayscale, but the grayscale values were off, and so now everything is muddy where you can't tell the difference between the foreground, middle ground, and background, or way too much detail everywhere all at once. The other time I would consider a panel too busy was when two times actually, The artist was trying to disorientate the reader because the character in the story was having a disorientating experience. They were going into the mouth of madness and they were slowly losing their mind. But the way they arranged the panels and the bubbles was that you had to read the bubbles and then turn the comic at the same time. And because there was I might be mixing two stories into one, but there were two timelines going at one time. One timeline was going forward, the other timeline was going backwards, and you would have to read the comic upright one way and then flip the comic and read it upright the other way. But this constant flipping upside and down of a book, I constantly kept getting lost in what was supposed to be going on, that I just quit the comic because I could not follow either story because I was too busy trying to figure out, am I reading this the right way? And if your reader is asking you, am I reading this the right way? You've lost them. Most people aren't going to do the heavy lifting to do this. Another comic that kicked me out, and not at fault of its own, but Assorted Crisis Events. I found the comic to be amazing, the storytelling to be amazing, and I thought the artist was doing some very unique things with the comic. However, the way the artist intended for the comic to be read was obviously in page format in a book. I was reading it on my phone, and I don't know how many comics you guys read on your phone or how many manga you read on your phone, but sometimes the experience is something to be desired. And this particular comic, even though I thought it was amazing, there was one particular story with it, the theme of the story was loops and cycles. So he was doing a lot of circular panel layouts. But the problem with this is that in page format, I want to believe 100% that the story was going to work. But in phone format, guided phone format, or guided reading format, the page layout did not work because the phone wanted me to read the beginning and end panel first, then it would take me around the page, but it didn't make sense, and I constantly had to keep zooming out and trying to read the page, and I noticed that the artist was doing some amazing things, but the format wasn't right. So that's something you can notice too. If you're making a very complicated panel layout, maybe you should lock it to just being read physically or at a page format instead of a side scrolling format. Or if you're intentionally making a webtoon, sometimes those webtoons that get printed into a book format don't necessarily translate the same way in a book format because their original intended viewing audience was a scrolling format. So just something to think about. Weak transitions from this could mean that you were in one location and you want to get the reader to another location, but for whatever reason, now we're lost. If the artist isn't being very clear on those transitions, or that this is a new area or a new location using either color differentiation or just a clear indication that this is a different place, if the artist didn't set that up properly, the reader will definitely feel it and feel lost in the same process. Unclear acting. This could happen to the best of us, and this can also happen to the rest of us. Unclear acting, you'll notice when you read a comic or a manga that the action is unclear. You don't know what they're doing. If they're supposed to be pulling a big sword out of their pocket, the artist doesn't properly set that up for it to be understood. You've lost the reader. Where the hell did this big sword come from? How did it even fit in his pocket? While you're reading a comic, if you are asking way too many questions considering just things that have nothing to do with the story. It's one thing if you're reading a comic or a manga and you're asking questions related to the story. Who is this person? How did they become as powerful as they did? Things like that, those questions make sense. But if you're looking at those minute details of how the hell does Guts pull that sword from behind his back, I don't know. And I'm not going to question it. Manga magic. But certain things, you want them to make sense, right? Should I leave that in? I don't know. Unclear acting could also be related to the facial expressions. Notice when an artist is having a tense moment and their character is forcing a smile, or maybe they are upset. Usually anger, I don't know why, but that seems to be the easiest for people to display. But are they angry, but yet they have a facial expression that looks like they don't care? Like, notice these things while you're reading comics and manga. Does the action that's happening in the panel carry what's happening subtly, or the overtext? Or is it like that meme, the mini expressions of Goku or something like that, where every single face, no matter the emotion, angry, sad, happy, joyful, silly, sleepy, all of them, the same exact face. If you notice that in your comic, or if you notice that in a comic or manga that you're reading, definitely take note and realize that you definitely want to act out whatever the story needs at that moment. Now, while you continue to read comics and manga, if you're like me, you're reading in multiple different genres. Yes, we all have our genres that we love. We love science fiction, we love fantasy, we love horror, action adventure, or romance for those of you who love romance. We all have our genres, and if you read in an extended genre for an extended amount of time, you're going to notice the tropes that will always show up. You're going to know the pacing of how horror works. Read several horror comics, especially really good ones. You're going to know that they use the same sorts of paneling and pacing at the same exact moments to build that tension. I'm talking about Uzumaki, Gannibal, Something is Killing the Children, Basilisk. These moments of tension all exist in the same method for horror. Or if you're reading an action comic, notice how action manga and action comics both handle their action scenes very differently. I love the energy behind manga, those speed lines. And the speed lines not only in the background, but the speed lines on the character itself. And still, not every comic does action lines, but the ones who do, who have that blend, chef's kiss. I'm talking about Daniel Warren Johnson with Do a Powerbomb, Extremity, Murder Falcon. The way he brings some of that manga influence over into comics, simply amazing. Notice these things. Notice when the action lines or the speed lines or that energy is needed for those panels. Imagine taking a panel that's supposed to be full of energy, but yet it looks like a static image. There's no energy there. And notice when it works and when it's too much. I don't really talk about it too much, but there's also comedy in comics. I do have one comic that has a lot of comedy in it that made me laugh. It's called The Last Halloween, The Children. And it has some great comedic beats. And if you read a lot of funny comics or funny manga, notice how those jokes are set up. Notice how they pace those jokes properly to hit exactly the way they need to hit and to cause you to laugh. And speaking of laughing, it doesn't even necessarily have to be a funny comic, but think about the comics that actually cause you to feel something. Think about those comics that make you feel upset or frustrated or worried or scared or sad. All of that is relevant. And ask yourself, why is this comic making me feel this way? What happened within these panels that made me exert an emotion by just reading it. As you read through different genres of comics and manga, you'll notice that different genres have their own pacing, and what is needed for your genre can be found in comics that have done it before you. Now, I said a lot. There's so much to notice from reading one comic or one manga, and you can't possibly do it all at the same time. Let's be honest. When you first get a new comic or manga, the last thing you're probably thinking about is reading it to understand it and study it. But read it first, enjoy it, love it, and then go back and reread it again, because hell, you already read it once, you already like it, so you might as well see why you liked it, why you love it, why it works. And you might have to do this multiple times. Study your favorites. Study the comics that people say are the best of the best. See what you do like about them and see what you don't like about them. There's plenty of comics that I've been recommended that everybody said was simply amazing. And I'm not saying those comics weren't amazing, but they weren't the comic for me. They weren't the manga for me. And at the heart of it all, that's what we want, right? Is that we want to learn from the comics that we love and adore, because we want to make comics that people love and adore. And the only way to bridge that gap is to see what's working and what can work, but not be afraid to try new things in the making. So I said all of that to say that when you are reading a comic that you are simply enjoying, when you are reading a manga that you cannot stop turning the page, ask yourself why. Ask yourself, why do I like this? Why do I want to turn the page? Why do I find this exciting? Why do I want to cry? If a comic makes you cry or a manga makes you cry, it's okay. It's okay. Like, those are the best. To me, the ones that make you feel something, those are the best comics and manga. But let's help each other out. We're all in this community to try and learn and get better. So in the comment section below, put down a comic or manga that you learned something from, and then put what you learned. I'll go first. I got two. One, a manga, which had Atelier. Two, a comic, Assorted Crisis Events. These two comics are doing non-standard paneling like I've never seen before. It is simply amazing. And I can't wait to do a panel deep dive or a first chapter review about both of these. Speaking of, if you're into studying comics and learning more about comics, I have an entire playlist dedicated to panel deep dives and first chapter reviews. Looking for that inciting incident. Those playlists are my way of studying comics and showing you how I'm looking at comics. And I plan on doing a ton more. If you've got recommendations for those videos, let me know in the comment section below. But that's the video, guys. Thank you for watching. I really want to thank all of you for staying to the end. I want to also thank you for subscribing to the channel. Links to my old comics and everything else down below. And until next time, let's make some progress.